The Chinese Grand Prix this weekend may be the first real test of whether Mercedes' victory in Australia was the beginning of a new dominance or something more controversial. At Albert Park, the Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team appeared significantly faster than many teams had expected. George Russell produced a qualifying lap that was nearly 0.80 of a second quicker than the nearest rival. In the opening phase of a new regulation era like 2026, a margin that large immediately draws the attention of the entire paddock. Some rivals initially assumed Russell's lap time in practice had to be a data error, but once qualifying and the race were complete, GPS analysis showed the same pattern. Mercedes held a clear advantage, particularly when the car was running in maximum performance modes and deploying electrical energy aggressively on the straights. What makes the situation even more interesting is that Mercedes customer teams were not showing the same level of performance. That suggests the advantage may not simply come from the engine itself, but from how Mercedes integrates the power unit, energy systems, and the overall car package. Now, attention shifts to the Chinese Grand Prix in Shanghai. The circuit features long straights and corner sequences that heavily reward efficient energy deployment. Two areas where Mercedes appeared particularly strong in Australia. If the same performance advantage appears again in China, it would be a strong indication that Mercedes may have discovered something their rivals have yet to fully understand. So the question now is this: will the Chinese Grand Prix confirm Mercedes' early dominance or reveal what is really behind their controversial engine performance in Australia? In this video, we're going to break down all the technical clues behind it. And if you enjoy this kind of analysis, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next Formula One breakdown. What immediately stood out to engineers across the paddock in Australia was not simply the outright lap time from the Mercedes, but the way that performance appeared across the lap. When analysts began studying the GPS traces, the pattern suggested a car that was consistently gaining time in phases where energy deployment mattered the most. Acceleration zones out of slower corners looked particularly strong, and the car continued to gain speed on the straights in a way that hinted at extremely efficient management of the new 2026 power unit systems. That alone would already be significant, but the wider context made it even more intriguing. The 2026 regulations place far greater emphasis on electrical energy within the power unit. The balance between combustion engine output and electrical deployment has changed dramatically compared with the previous generation. Teams now have to manage how that electrical energy is harvested, stored, and deployed around the lap in a much more strategic way. In Australia, Mercedes appeared to have mastered that balance far earlier than most of their rivals. One of the interesting points raised within the paddock after the race was the difference between the performance of the Mercedes Works team and the teams running Mercedes engines as customers. If the advantage had come purely from the internal combustion engine itself, the expectation would be that customer teams would display a similar level of straight-line performance. But that was not what the data suggested. Instead, the Works Mercedes appeared able to extract more performance from the same hardware that strongly points towards integration. In modern Formula One, integration between the power unit, the battery system, the cooling layout, and the car's aerodynamics is often where the final tenths of performance are found. The way energy is deployed down the straights, the way heat is managed within the car, and the way the aerodynamic package reduces drag, all combine to determine how effectively that power unit performs in real conditions. This is why many engineers were cautious about jumping to conclusions immediately after Australia. While the lap time advantage looked dramatic, it is possible that the Mercedes package simply happened to be particularly well suited to the characteristics of Albert Park. Even so, several figures in the paddock acknowledged that the numbers were striking. Strategist and analyst Bernie Collins pointed out in her post-race analysis that a gap approaching 80-10 in qualifying is extremely unusual at the start of a regulation cycle, particularly when most teams are still discovering the true limits of their new packages. That observation reflects a broader reality of Formula One's technical cycles. At the beginning of a new set of regulations, teams are often working with incomplete understanding of how the cars will behave across different circuits. The team that finds the most efficient solution first can sometimes enjoy a substantial advantage before others catch up. But the question is whether that is what is happening here. There were also moments in Australia that suggested the gap might not be quite as absolute as the headline numbers indicated. During the race itself, the pace of the Ferrari appeared more competitive over longer runs. Scuderia Ferrari looked capable of staying within range during certain phases of the race, especially when tyre degradation began to play a larger role. Charles Leclerc, in particular, was able to challenge during the early stages thanks to a strong start that placed him directly in contention with Russell. However, strategy and track position ultimately played a decisive role in shaping the outcome. Once the race settled into its rhythm, Mercedes appeared to retain a performance margin that allowed Russell to manage the race from the front. That margin might not have been as dramatic as the qualifying gap, but it was still significant enough to control the race. And that leads to the next critical step in the analysis. How much of this advantage is circuit-specific? Albert Park has its own particular demands. The track combines several medium-speed corners with relatively short bursts of acceleration, which can favor cars that are especially strong in traction and energy deployment. Shanghai presents a very different challenge. The circuit used for the Chinese Grand Prix features one of the longest straights in Formula One, along with a sequence of demanding corners that place heavy emphasis on both aerodynamic efficiency and energy management. That makes it an ideal circuit to test the theory that Mercedes has found something special within the 2026 power unit era. If the advantage seen in Australia came largely from energy deployment efficiency, Shanghai should amplify that strength. But if the advantage was more related to the specific characteristics of Albert Park, then the gap could narrow significantly. This is precisely why engineers across several teams are paying close attention to the data as the championship moves to China. There is also another dimension to the story, and that concerns the broader development trajectory of the teams involved. Formula One seasons are rarely static. The pace advantage seen in the opening race often triggers rapid responses from rivals. Engineers immediately begin comparing their own data with the leading car, searching for clues that might explain the performance gap. In many cases, those clues are not immediately obvious. Deployment strategies, software calibration, and cooling efficiencies are areas that cannot always be reverse-engineered quickly through external data alone. That means the early races of the season often become a crucial window of opportunity for the team that starts ahead. Mercedes has experienced that situation before. During the early years of the turbo hybrid era, the team established a performance lead that took rivals several seasons to fully overcome. Much of that advantage initially came from the integration between the power unit and the chassis. That historical context is one reason why the performance in Australia attracted so much attention. When a team with Mercedes' technical resources appears to begin a new regulation cycle with a significant advantage, the paddock inevitably starts asking questions. But it is also worth remembering that Formula One rarely follows a completely predictable script. Development rates vary dramatically between teams. What looks like a comfortable lead in one race can shrink quickly once upgrades begin to arrive. That is why the Chinese Grand Prix carries such importance. A second race confirming the same performance pattern would strengthen the argument that Mercedes has genuinely found a superior solution within the 2026 regulations. On the other hand, a closer race could suggest that the competitive picture is far more balanced than Australia initially indicated. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the next round so fascinating from a technical perspective. Because once the cars take to the track in Shanghai, the data will begin to reveal whether Mercedes' advantage is structural or situational. If the acceleration traces and energy deployment patterns once again show the Mercedes gaining time in the same areas, rival teams will know that they are dealing with something fundamental in the design philosophy of the car. But if the gaps compress and other teams appear more competitive, the narrative around the opening race may start to look very different. So as the championship moves to China, the key question remains the same one that emerged immediately after Australia. Did Mercedes simply execute a near-perfect opening weekend with a well-balanced car? Or have they already unlocked something in the new power unit regulations that the rest of the field has yet to catch up with? And perhaps the bigger question for the season ahead is this: if Mercedes truly has discovered a more effective way to integrate the 2026 power unit systems, how long will it take the rest of the grid to find the same answers? What do you think? Is Mercedes already one step ahead in the new era of Formula One? Or will the Chinese Grand Prix expose a much closer fight than Australia suggested? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear how you see this playing out as the championship heads to Shanghai.